Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. Today's video is about two of Canada's sickest serial killers, Bernardo and Karla Homolka. Bernardo grew up in Scarborough, Ontario. His upbringing is typical of a lot of serial killers. His father was extremely abusive. Paul grew up watching his mother receive regular beatings and his sister being sexually assaulted by her own dad. His father also had a habit of prowling around the neighbourhood at night and peeping into young girls' windows, a habit which later seemed to rub off on Paul. Outwardly though, as a child it didn't seem to affect him much. Bernardo was confident and outgoing. He joined the Scouts, and as he got older he went on to become a Scout counsellor, where he was very popular with the young children. At the age of 16 he discovered that the man who had raised him was not actually his biological father. His mother had had an affair with another man and gotten pregnant with Paul. This revelation that he was the bastard child of infidelity triggered a deep hatred of women within Bernardo. Fueled by the abuse he had witnessed growing up, he developed dark, misogynistic, sadistic sexual fantasies. His first job was working for the Amway multi-level marketing company, essentially a pyramid scheme. Through his work he learned useful psychological sales techniques. He studied books on motivational speaking, the art of selling and pick-up artistry. He didn't just use these skills on the job though, he also used them to manipulate the girls he was dating. He liked submissive girls, ones that he could abuse emotionally and humiliate in public, ones that went along with his rough sex games. Over the years, he learned a lot about how to control women. His sexual sadism increased in severity until, in July of 1987, aged just 22, Bernardo committed his first known rape attack. A 21-year-old woman was walking home from work at 1 AM when Paul snuck up behind her and dragged her to the ground. She was right outside her house at the time. Over the course of about 30 minutes, he repeatedly beat the woman whilst vaginally and anally penetrating her. A few days later, he committed a very similar attack on a 19-year-old woman. Again, she was walking home in the early hours of the morning and was outside her house when he attacked. Paul pushed her to the ground and dragged her into her backyard. There, he held a knife to her throat and threatened to slit it if she made a sound. He then tied a rope around her neck and started to beat and molest her. Anytime she moved, he would tighten the rope and strangle her. The attack lasted over an hour. When he was done, he bound her wrists and tied her by the neck to a fence, then he left. A couple of months later, Paul met Karla Homolka. Karla's childhood probably didn't involve as much abuse as Paul's, but she does recall many occasions where her drunken father would fight with her mother. During these outbursts, her and her sisters would huddle together for safety. In her teenage years, she began to display strange behaviour. She became obsessed with crime stories and subjects of death and occultism. She would hold strange spiritualist seances for her friends. On one occasion, she threw her friend's hamster out a window, killing it. One of her high school boyfriends recalls how she was preoccupied with the thought of dying, wanting to know how it felt to be killed, even cutting herself with a knife. Of course, none of these things in isolation would be too strange as far as teenage behaviour goes, but given what we know about Karla today, they were probably warning signs of a deeper psychological problem. There was something different about Karla compared to the other girls that Bernardo had dated. Instead of running away from his sadistic urges, she seemed to encourage it, becoming a willing and submissive participant in his increasingly violent sex games. Over time, Paul became more and more controlling. He began telling her how to dress, how to style her hair, and what kind of makeup to wear. He began undermining her confidence and isolating her from her friends. Slowly, he was turning her into his slave. This new relationship didn't stop Paul from prowling the streets at night and attacking innocent women, though. Over the course of 3 years, he attacked at least 16 different women, and those are only the ones that are definitely linked to Paul Bernardo. The figure is more likely around 25 women. To describe each attack would be a long and repetitive process. Each attack followed a very similar pattern, but with each one the level of violence and cruelty increased. He would pick a young girl walking alone at night. 14 or 15-year-olds were his favourite. Some were older, in their early 20s, but they looked young. Clearly he had a type. He would lurk at a bus stop till they went past, and then he would pounce on them from behind and drag them to the ground, usually subduing them with a few blows to the head. He would then drag them to a more secluded location and tie them up, often with a rope around their neck so that he could strangle them. If they struggled, he would hold a knife to their neck and threaten to slit their throats. He liked to punch them a lot, in the back, in the head, in the legs. On one occasion, he twisted a woman's arm so hard that he fractured the bone. The rapes all followed a similar pattern. First sodomy, then vaginal penetration. While he was doing this, he would push the girl's face into the ground and run his knife up and down her back. After that, he would force her to perform fellatio on him. Sometimes he would insert foreign objects into the victim's vagina or anus, usually sticks and twigs. One time he raped a woman with his knife blade, lacerating her uterus. Making the victim talk was also a big part of the attacks. He would force her to call herself a bitch and a slut. He would make her say that she loved what he was doing to her, that he was the best she ever had. These attacks usually lasted between 30 minutes and 2 hours. Sometimes he would get up and leave so that the victim thought that the ordeal was over, only to return moments later and continue assaulting her. When he was finally done, he usually stole some sort of memento, a driver's license or ID card, something with a photograph to remember them by. As time went on, police noticed the similarities between these attacks and realised they were the work of a serial rapist. Unfortunately, because he always struck in the middle of the night and made his victims face the floor, it was very hard to get a clear identification of the attacker. Pretty soon, news articles were appearing in the local papers warning people to be vigilant. They even gave him a nickname, the Scarborough Rapist. On May 26, 1990, Paul struck again, attacking a 19-year-old woman behind a school. After an hour of torture and sexual abuse, he turned around and yanked out a fistful of her pubic hair as something to remember her by. This enabled her to get a good look at her attacker, so much so that the police were able to compile a very accurate composite image of the Scarborough rapist. The police received 2 tip-offs from people who believed that Paul Bernardo was the attacker. One was from a bank teller who thought that he looked a lot like the composite image. Another report was from Tina Smyrnis, the wife of one of Paul's best friends. The police brought Paul in for questioning, and he willingly gave them a DNA sample. He also admitted that he did look a lot like the composite image, but here's the crazy thing. He was so charming and likeable that they decided that there was no way such a well-adjusted young man could be the attacker. They assumed Tina Smyrnis must just have been trying to claim the reward money, and so they let Paul go and they didn't send his DNA for testing. By this point in their lives, Paul and Karla were engaged, and Karla had got a job at a veterinary clinic. Paul was spending a lot of time with Karla's family at her house, and he'd taken a particular liking to Karla's 15-year-old sister, Tammy. On nights when he stayed over, he would sneak outside and peer in on Tammy through her bedroom window. Karla even helped Paul out by breaking the locks on Tammy's window so he could sneak in while she was sleeping and masturbate. He told Karla how much he wanted to sleep with her sister, and with a little bit of persuasion she agreed to let him. So one night they crushed up several sleeping tablets and served them up to Tammy mixed into spaghetti sauce. Pretty soon she'd fallen asleep, and while she was unconscious, Paul had sex with her while Karla watched. This wasn't enough to satiate Paul's urges. 5 months later, he told Karla that he wanted to do it again. By this point, he'd moved in with Karla and was living with her and her family. He persuaded Karla to steal some halothane from her job at the veterinary practice. Halothane is a very powerful anesthetic. They use it to knock animals out when they're undergoing surgery. It's very dangerous if it's not administered by a professional. On Christmas Eve 1990, whilst her parents slept upstairs, Karla served Tammy an alcoholic cocktail laced with sleeping pills. Once she had fallen asleep, they dragged her into the basement and set up the video camera. Paul liked making home movies. Most of them were innocent family snaps, short glimpses into everyday life with Karla and her family. He did, however, like making another type of movie, and Tammy Homolka was about to have a starring role. Karla took a cloth and soaked it in the halothane, and then she held it over Tammy's face to make sure she was really unconscious. Then, while the camera was rolling, Paul and Karla took turns having sex with Tammy's unconscious body. At one point, Paul forces Karla to suck her sister's menstrual blood from her fingers. She complains that it tastes disgusting, and Paul beats her for not showing enough enthusiasm. In the early hours of the morning, whilst Paul was sodomizing Tammy, she choked on her own vomit and stopped breathing. By the time they noticed, her face had turned blue and there was no pulse whatsoever. In a panic, they attempted to resuscitate her with CPR, but they failed. Paramedics were called and she was rushed to hospital, but by that point there was nothing they could do. On Christmas Day 1990, Tammy Homolka was pronounced dead. Karla and Paul were questioned about Tammy's death. They told police that she simply had passed out from drinking too much and must have vomited in her sleep. The problem with this story is the halothane-soaked rag had caused a massive chemical burn on the side of Tammy's face and around her mouth and nose. For some reason, despite this, the authorities accepted Paul and Karla's version of events and ruled Tammy's death to be accidental. After that, Paul started making Karla dress up in her dead sister's clothes, and they would have sex on Tammy's bed among her collection of teddy bears. One detail I find particularly sick is that at Tammy's funeral they placed a photograph of themselves in her coffin. This was the image they picked to put inside the coffin alongside Tammy's corpse, the little girl they murdered on Christmas Day. Something about it just comes across as incredibly twisted. The mocking grins in the photo seem to be saying, "We know what we did and we think it's funny." By June of 1991, Karla and Paul were married and had moved into their own place. As a wedding gift to Paul, Karla brought home the drugged and unconscious body of a 15-year-old girl that she'd befriended years before. She'd taken her out for a girly shopping trip before plying her with spiked cocktails. They filmed themselves sexually abusing the girl while she slept. The next morning, that girl, known only as Jane Doe, had no recollection of what had happened and assumed she'd just had too much to drink. A month later, they invited Jane Doe back to their place and spiked her again with sleeping pills. Once more, they videotaped themselves raping the girl, but this time she stopped breathing halfway through. They phoned for an ambulance, but Jane Doe started breathing again shortly afterwards, so they rang the emergency services back again and told them that everything was alright now. The ambulance was recalled and Jane Doe went home, once more without realising the terrible things that they'd done to her. On June 15th, 1991, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey was returning home. She was supposed to be home by 11 p.m, but she'd stayed out drinking with her friends into the early hours of the morning. As punishment, her mother had bolted the doors, locking Leslie out of the house. Unfortunately for Leslie, that night Paul Bernardo was also on the prowl. He spotted the young girl alone outside her house and struck up a conversation with her. Apparently she was unfazed by a strange man prowling around her property at 2 a.m. He invited her back to his car for a cigarette, then produced a knife and forced her into the vehicle. He took her back to his place and led her blindfolded into the front room. There he made her kneel on the ground and state her name and age whilst he recorded her with the camera. He then led her into the bathroom and made her urinate whilst he filmed between her legs. After that, he took her to the spare bedroom and tied her by the wrists to the headboard. He told her to stop crying. When she didn't, he punched her in the face, splitting her lip over her metal braces. That night, Leslie was subjected to multiple rapes, beatings, and humiliations. She was forced to masturbate for the camera. He made her say how much she loved it, how he was the best she ever had. He made her drink champagne laced with sleeping pills to make her more compliant. When Karla awoke later that morning, she saw Leslie and Paul in bed together and she was infuriated. Not because he'd kidnapped and sexually assaulted a child, but because he'd used their best champagne flutes. Over the following several hours, Karla and Paul subjected Leslie to various sexual humiliations whilst they recorded the whole thing on their camcorder. At one point on the videotape, whilst Leslie is forced to stick her tongue into Paul's anus, he says to her, "I'm judging you right now. The next 2 hours are going to determine what I do to you, okay? Right now you're scoring perfect." Sometime after midnight, they were finally done with her. By this point, they'd been torturing her for around 24 hours. She lay in a fetal position on the floor, a bruised and broken wreck bleeding from every orifice. They knew there was no way they could let Leslie go. Although they'd kept her blindfolded, she might still be able to identify them to the police. In a hushed conversation in another room, Karla and Paul decided that they had to kill her. Whilst Paul went to fetch what he needed, Karla returned to Leslie and put a blanket over her. She gave her a teddy bear to hug, then told her to swallow some sleeping pills. As Leslie drifted off to sleep, Paul returned with a length of electrical cord. He wrapped it around her neck and strangled her. It took 2 attempts before she was finally dead. They dumped her body in the basement and covered her with a sheet. Whilst Leslie's corpse grew cold, Karla's parents paid a visit to the house and they enjoyed a family meal together in the room right above her head. The next day, Paul visited the hardware store and bought 12 bags of cement powder. Back at the house, they laid out Leslie's body on an old tarpaulin sheet and cut her into pieces. They encased each piece in a lump of cement, and then, over the course of a few days, they made numerous trips to Lake Gibson, 18 miles away from their home, and dumped the pieces into the water. One particularly large block of cement containing Leslie's torso and head was too heavy to carry to the lake, so they just left it by the water's edge. It would later be found by a father and son out on a fishing trip. The third and last known kidnapping occurred on April 16th, 1992. Karla and Paul were driving around looking for a suitable victim. Sadly for 15-year-old Kristen French, she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. They spotted her walking home from school, so they parked up in a nearby church parking lot and waited for her to walk by. Karla approached holding a map and asked her for directions. Whilst Kristen was distracted looking at the map, Paul approached from behind, held a knife to her neck and forced her into the car. Back at the house, her treatment was very much the same as what they'd done to Leslie Mahaffey. She was drugged with alcohol and tranquilizers, repeatedly beaten and raped, urinated on and forced to perform humiliating acts for the camera. She was violated with a wine bottle and made to tell them how much she loved it and how amazing Paul Bernardo was. Unlike Leslie Mahaffey, they didn't bother to blindfold her because this time they knew beforehand that they were going to murder her. Pretty soon after her disappearance, her parents filed a missing persons report. When police found one of Kristen's shoes in the church parking lot, they suspected that foul play was involved. One of the cruel things that Paul did was to make Kristen watch news reports of her father pleading for a safe return. Between torture sessions, they would lock Kristen in a cupboard. Sometimes Paul would leave to get food, and during those moments Kristen would plead with Karla to let her go. Of course, this fell on deaf ears. After 3 days of torture, with Kristen on the bed with her hands bound behind her back, Paul mounted her from behind and wrapped an electrical cord tightly around her throat. He bent down and whispered something into her ear. Karla didn't catch all of it, but she heard him say, "What do you know about dying?" He then tightened the cord and Kristen began to choke. He timed himself on the bedside clock, strangling her airways for a full 7 minutes to ensure she was dead. When they were done, they stashed her corpse in the basement and went to Karla's parents' house for another family meal. On April 30th, Kristen's body was found dumped in a ditch 45 minutes away from where Paul and Karla lived. The corpse had been thoroughly washed and all her hair had been removed. One weird detail here is that Karla Homolka started to become convinced that her home was haunted. She would hear weird knocks and bangs coming from the basement, and sometimes she'd hear someone calling her name even when nobody else was home. She even consulted a medium to try and cleanse the house of its evil spirits. Much like Poe's tale of the Telltale Heart, these haunting noises were probably a sign of the guilt plaguing Karla's mind, slowly unravelling her last shreds of mental stability. Paul Bernardo's mental state was also becoming increasingly unstable. He became even more abusive towards Karla. One night he beat her so badly that he left her with 2 extremely swollen black eyes. This was the final straw for Karla. She fled the house and went to stay with her family friend whose husband was a police officer. Upon seeing her injuries, they took her to a hospital and the police were called in. This is when police started to seriously investigate Paul Bernardo. By now it was February in 1993, and they finally decided to test the DNA samples that he'd provided 3 years earlier, and they found out that he was in fact the Scarborough rapist. Upon further questioning, Karla realised that they'd tied her and Paul to the murdered girls. She got herself a good lawyer and agreed to fully cooperate in the investigation in return for leniency. Paul was arrested and the house was searched. Police found a detailed diary written by Paul describing each of his rapes and murders. Eventually the video recordings were recovered too. The videotapes were instrumental in the court proceedings. Obviously, Paul Bernardo had very little defence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Karla's defence was a little more complicated. It really depends on how much of a story you believe. She was clearly the victim of abuse, and she painted herself as a completely unwilling participant in the crimes. She said that Paul threatened to murder her family if she didn't comply. Some believe that she was completely brainwashed. On the other hand, she had multiple chances to get away, especially while she was still living in her parents' house. The videotapes played in court showed that instead of being an unwilling victim, she was an enthusiastic and eager participant in the crimes. Unfortunately, her plea for leniency had already been accepted before the videotapes had been seen. She was given just a 12-year prison sentence. A number of photographs surfaced whilst Karla was incarcerated. These ones I find particularly interesting. A convicted paedophile and child murderer happily playing on a rocking horse and in a child's playhouse. It's as if she's taunting the victims' families from inside jail. In 2005, she was granted parole. Since leaving prison, she's married again and she's had 3 children. In 2017, it was reported that she was volunteering at an elementary school, although the media storm this generated means she stopped volunteering shortly after it was discovered. As for Paul Bernardo, he still languishes in prison. He was up for parole in 2018, but it was denied because of his high likelihood of reoffending. As with most incarcerated child molesters, he probably regularly receives the kind of treatment he dished out to his victims. Thank you for watching this video. If you're new here and you found this interesting, then please consider subscribing. Big thanks as always to everyone who is supporting the channel on Patreon and PayPal. I know I'm beginning to sound like a stuck record at this point, but I really couldn't make these videos without your help, so thank you very much. On screen now there should be some more videos if you're in the mood for something else. Thanks once again for watching. Until next time, goodbye.